Hey everybody, it's Brian Coley, the Movie Whisperer. This is a place where we look at the intersection of our story with our movies. And today I want to look at an Oscar nominee that I think is perfect for this week. This week happens to be, as a person of faith, the Passion Week, in which Easter is this coming Sunday. And I think that this film, believe it or not, is the perfect Easter film. And I would go a step further and say that I believe it is a faith-based film. It just doesn't know it. So the film that I'm speaking of, drum roll, please, it's an Oscar nominee, and it is Nomadland. I watched this film 3 times, one time in IMAX, and I just can't tell you, every single time I would walk away from this film, I would be like, this film is so spiritual, and I can't put my finger on why. And then finally, I just figured it out, and I want to share with you some of those reasons today of why I think it is the perfect faith-based film. For those of you who don't know the film, I want to explain the plot for you. I'll show a little bit of the trailer here so you can get some images to go with. Like I said, it's up for the Best Picture this year. It's a front runner. People think it's going to win. And Frances McDormand, who's the actress, plays a character named Fern. The movie starts with Fern opening a storage bin. She's getting some last remaining things that she wants before she hits the road in her van, in which she's going to live this transient life as a nomad in her van. She comes from a town called Empire, and Empire has just dried up. The factory has died, the economy has collapsed, and there's just track houses that are left empty. And so she takes her stuff and she climbs into her van and makes a home out of her van and starts to travel, picking up odd jobs and working in places like Amazon during the seasonal time of the busyness of Amazon. And she meets these other nomads in which she gets together with them with rallies, and she's learning on how to live this nomadic life. And she creates this community with them. And then, of course, what we find out also is that she's lost her husband. And so a lot of this journey is her processing her grief along the way. So that's Nomadland. It's a film that I highly recommend if you haven't seen it to see it. It is one of those films where it's very, slow, and you have to be, I would recommend seeing it in the theater and not being distracted with all kinds of things around your television, but it's a great film. Now, how is this a faith-based film, you may ask? Well, there's no mentions of God in it. In fact, I don't think there's any religious aspect to it at all in the film as far as mentions of religion. I think she sings "What Child Is This?" is like the closest thing at Christmas time to anything of faith being mentioned in the film. However, there's something about this film that I was trying to get to the heart to, and I have a word for it. The word is Bbophum. It comes from the Urban Dictionary. A friend of mine, Kim Bird, found it and pointed it out to me. And it's just this beautiful idea of, let's say that I ask you, do you want some chocolate cake or do you want some chocolate ice cream? And you would say, I want both of them, both of them. In other words, we don't live in this mutually exclusive kind of thought process, but the idea that two values that might seem like contradictions or opposites are somehow held together in this gravity, this tension together, and can even be blended. And I feel like that this word has transformed my faith. Now, when I think of God in relationship to this Bbophum, this mystery, this paradox. So if I were to say, is God a God of grace or is God a God of justice? You would say, well, he's a God of both of them, right? And that's sort of the way God exists. He exists in these paradoxes that we as human beings often find ourselves in a ditch in one or the other, right? So there's churches that are all about grace and there's churches that are all about justice. And it's hard for us to hold these things in tension like God does. And this is what Chloe Zhao, the director of Nomadland, does so beautifully in the film. Like everywhere you turn in Nomadland, you bump up against a Bbophum. The first Bbophum is just a miracle of filmmaking, is that she blends this sort of fact and fiction. In fact, when you watch the film, you're like, is this a documentary or is this a feature film? Is this fiction or fact? I'm not sure, because she takes these actors who are real nomads and they are actors in the film, and you can't really see the difference between which ones are the actors and which ones are not the actors in the film. She just blends fact and fiction so closely together. And I've listened to different interviews with her, and she talks about how she's trying to get to this humanity by, blending this fact and fiction together, this Bbophum. So that's one. The second one that's very evident is here is Fern, who goes and lives and makes her home in this confined space of this van. And yet at the same time, there's a beautiful picture of the van going down the road. And in the background is all of this wide open landscape. So there's this Bbophum of the confinement in relationship to this expansiveness, this boundlessness that you see in the landscape. And then, of course, Fern is very self-sustaining. She's very independent. She is one of those kind of, ones who's going to do it all herself. And then she lives in community with these folks that she finds, other nomads. And we just enjoy her meeting all these different people and finding this community with them. And so that idea of community and against freedom, or dependence against independence, is another Bbophum in the film that just comes out. And again, these are Bbophums that I feel are present with God himself. Like it's definitely true of our humanity, but God makes this perfect paradox of these two things together. So every time a Bbophum comes out of the film, I feel like God's presence is there. There's a moment in the film in which she lands in this town, this kitschy tourist trap town. And this particular image is an image that I love from the film. It's this image of this dinosaur that's been confined by this little fence. I guess what happened was there's a tourist attraction and kids must try to climb up it. And so they had to put a fence around it. But once again, it speaks to this confinement and this boundlessness, right? Like how can you keep a dinosaur in a fence like that? Like that image alone is great. But the other image that this speaks to is something that I love about the film, this Bbophum of the idea of the temporary, or the I don't know how to say it right, temporal, the temporary and the eternal. When you think of dinosaurs, you think of time, you think of this endlessness of time. And the director takes us on this journey of seeing so much landscape of time. In fact, there's this, let me see if I can bring up this shot here. Where is it? There it is. This is a shot of her in the sequoia trees. And you just, everywhere you go, you see this sense of like the eternal, and this earth, these rivers that have always seemingly been with us, these trees that have been with us, these mountains that have been with us, this desert that's been with us, this sense of eternal that sort of this dinosaur represents, of, this endlessness of time. And yet at the same time, she works at this plant in Amazon, and we get the sense of this manufactured world. And she comes from empire in which this manufacturing we were so dependent on this manufacturing. And then she goes to her sister's house, and you see her trying to like sleep in a bed and be a part of home ownership. And it's just not really where she belongs. And so you see this kind of tension between the idea of what's temporary, what's manufactured, what God has given us as a gift of mankind to make things. And yet at the same time, there's this eternal that's all around us in nature. And so I just love the fact that every time I see this film, it just gives me that sense of that Bbophum that comes out. And so this is the aspect of the film, this idea of a Bbophum that really impressed upon me, that there was something spiritual going on that invited God's presence in this film. But it wasn't until this morning that all of a sudden these light bulbs just went off inside of me as far as it connecting to Jesus and this Holy Week. So all of a sudden I woke up this morning and I went, oh my gosh, Jesus is the OG nomad, right? Like Jesus lived this nomadic lifestyle. In fact, I just saw, all of a sudden I saw this film as if Jesus and Fern were almost the same as far as their journey, because Fern comes from this blue collar town and she makes this decision to go and live this nomadic lifestyle. And Jesus was from this blue collar town, Nazareth, and he makes this decision to go, start this lifestyle, this ministry that he has. And of course, she meets this community of people, of other nomads. And Jesus calls out this community of disciples to be nomads with him. And Jesus has these rallies, he does the Sermon on the Mount and she's going to these rallies. Everywhere I looked in this film, I started seeing the life of Jesus as a nomad. It was so beautiful. And it's something that I would just encourage you to watch as you watch this film. But then it also spoke to something inside of me that I've been wrestling with all today, is just the idea of, are we supposed to be nomads? Like, especially people of faith, aren't we supposed to be nomads? Like, are we supposed to not cling to, we live in the tension of this temporary world of things that are manufactured in relationship to this eternal faith. I love the film because at the very end, it kind of lands on this concept of, I'll see you down the road. And that speaks so much to my faith, of this eternal nature of, that this life is not the end, that we do see each other, or there is this road ahead of us that's not confined by this world and this life. And yet this world is so beautiful and full of God and full of the things we make that reflect the beauty of God. And so I just feel like that this nomadic heart I'm kind of wrestling with today, and going, how much of me is that nomad, just like Jesus? How much of me is more into the isms of consumerism and materialisms and all these other isms? And how much do I define my life by those isms versus defining my life as a nomad who's more connected to the earth, who's more connected to things that are eternal? So hopefully you see how Nomadland, to me at least, is a faith-based film. And I would highly recommend it as the film you watch as you look at this week and Easter coming up, especially if you're a person of faith. And if you're not a person of faith, that you would just dive into the spiritual aspect of it and see if it awakens something that is spiritual in you that maybe connects to who God is, this paradox of God, and of who I believe he is in this idea of a Bbophum. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the special video on Passion Week, and we'll see you next time on The Movie Whisperer.